is a renowned poet, a scholar for over 40 years, and a committed feminist. She's also a profound connoisseur of African women's literature, working in the areas of Black diasporic studies, Blackness, history, and women's gender and sexuality. Abena Busia uses poetry to explore Black feminism, women's writing, and oral traditions from the past to the present. On top of all this, she's currently serving as the ambassador of Ghana to Brazil and to consolidate the Pan-African Heritage Museum in the country. Today, I will speak with these fantastic women who will share these and other stories with us on our talk show. So, Ambassador, that's a pleasure having you here. I'm sure we have a lot of interesting and important topics to talk today, but I'd like to start by the most trending topic, the museum, the Pan-African Heritage Museum. What is this and why Brazil was chosen to be part of this project?
Well, wonderful. That's why Brazil is easy, and I'll get to that. But I think I'd like to begin by explaining that this is actually a project with a long-term vision. And so I'd like to say it's a museum complex. That is, this is a project that has started. It exists already as a virtual museum, which I'll talk about. But with the next stage, which is the reason for the immediate trending nature of it, is to build the physical museum. But the physical museum, the kind of physical 5-story structure, is part of a projected larger complex. So the plot itself is a large, I think it's 10-acre plot, and it's going to have on it the museum itself, a Pan-African library, and innovation hub. It'll have a sculpture park with Pan-African diasporic heroines and heroes in it. It'll have, I think we call it the Kingdoms or the African Empires Pavilion, where we try to replicate the visuality of other ancient African cultures in that same complex. We'll have a restaurant on the premises serving food from all over Africa, as well as, on the ground floor, the things you always find in museums, the gallery, the souvenir shop, a theater, etc. So I just wanted to say we are trying to get the museum, the 5-story museum built very, that'll kind of materialize the digital museum that exists. But it is actually a larger, long-term project celebrating African civilizations and African knowledge. For me, for example, one of the most important aspects of it will be the herbal park, the garden with chalets for visiting and contemplation, which will grow and replicate African herbal medicines and plants and so on, to reconstruct that knowledge that we've always had. So it's a much greater it's a grand holistic vision of this complex. I wanted to say that first, that it's what people think of as a conventional museum is part of a larger grand vision.
And why Brazil?
Oh, please. Why not Brazil? One of the things that people don't realize, when you think of Blacks in the Americas, Africans in the Americas, people's mind tends to go to the United States of America because of the dominance of the United States and the vivacity of African American culture, which has given us, Toni Morrison and jazz and all the rest of it. But really, historically, it is known that only 6% of those of us transported across the Atlantic ended up in North America. 6%. So where are the other 94%? The other 94% are here in Brazil, the rest of South America, and the Caribbean. So Brazil, as we know, is the largest has the largest African descent peoples of any country in the diaspora, you know. That's why Brazil. You are here. Your Brazilian culture, so African culture is so deeply ingrained in Brazilian culture, you sometimes don't recognize it. You know, tourists come to Brazil and they want to eat Brazilian food, and the first thing they eat is feijoada and acarajé. And people in Bahia know the sources of that food, but do people in the rest of the country, even let alone the rest of the world? I mean, those foods survived because they are foods sacred to particular African gods. And there's a long history of why those women kept those recipes, guarded them, protected them. The reason feijoada, acarajé is considered by UNESCO a part of your intangible heritage is because UNESCO has recognized the history and culture that has protected that food. So why Brazil? Because Brazil is an African country, and because Brazil has preserved the legacy and has the memory. And when we use the word preserve, people very often, because we know, like in culinary, to preserve means to keep it as it is, but it changes it. If you put something, preserve it in vinegar or salt or sugar or whatever it is, you know, peaches and crystalline peaches are not exactly the same thing. And that's true of the African heritage culture in Brazil. It has been preserved, it has been maintained, and it is recognizable in some, like a preserved peach. A crystalline peach is clearly a peach. In other cases, it's been transformed, transmuted, has been impacted by the very complicated and complex history of Brazil. Contact with indigeneity, everything from indigenous people to Italians, you know. But Brazil, because clearly Brazil is an African country, and Brazil recognizes that it is an African country.
And what is the biggest importance for not only for the Brazilian people or the Ghanaian people, but for the whole world, this existence of this museum? Why did it take too long, if I can say so?
Why did it take too long is a good question. I think the existence of it is part of a larger movement that we are all doing of reconnecting our history. You know, diaspora means a scattering, right? And at some point, what has happened is not only do the scattered children recognize they were dispersed from Africa, but they have recognized that that dispersal does not have to be permanent, and that we're looking for each other and sharing each other's stories and recognizing who we were and what we've done, recognizing the changes that have taken place amongst ourselves, but sharing. So it's important because it is part of a movement to reconnect and to tell ourselves who we are. And one of the things that has been happening is that a lot of work has been done, but in silos. So the British have done wonderful, wonderful work. They fought for the Slavery Museum in Liverpool. They've got what's going on in London and all of those things. They've done the same in the United States, etc. And we've got people here in Brazil who have worked for decades on the African nature of Brazil. We've been working separately. And there are now organizations like the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora and other movements saying, you know, we need to stop working separately and work together and connect. And that's one of the things that this is part of that. You know, this is, of course, I'm invested in this museum and tied to it, and it's special to me because I'm on the board. But it's also important and it's in Ghana, and everybody in Ghana is excited about it. But I think it's important to acknowledge that it is part of a worldwide movement of celebration and recognition.
Absolutely. And speaking of your presence on the board, which means the presence of a woman, the presence of female leadership, how women's history and culture will be planned on this museum?
Well, first of all, I'm not the only woman on the board. There are a lot of us, including very distinguished people like, for example, Vereen Shepherd from the Caribbean. And our academic board is chaired by a woman, by the wonderful scholar Sheila Walker, who is an incredible scholar of the African diaspora, who led one of the first conferences in the late 80s about the African diaspora in South America. So there are women on the board who are committed to including the role of women, by which we mean not only, for every hero there's a shero, but using the way in which feminist historiography, the way in which non-traditional things, the way in which invisible things have shaped our history is brought to the fore and structures the programming and the presentation of the history. And by that I mean, it's a truism. History has been written by the winners, right? And therefore the counterpart is anonymous was a woman. But I mentioned food, for example. It is one of the impacts of feminist historiography that we look at the domestic, that we look at food, that we look at modes of dress and other ways of communication that are parts for them to become considered a form of history. I'd like to tell a personal story. Please. That taught me something. There was, I've been a professor for 40 years. There was one particular semester for some odd conglomeration of forces, the 3 courses I was teaching that semester, I taught all 3 of them on a Monday. 2 were, one was Monday, Wednesday, one was Monday, Thursday, but then there was one which was just a long period on Monday nights. That meant basically I was teaching from 9 a.m. to about 10 p.m. on Mondays. And it meant I could do very little else. I kept a physical journal of appointments and things like that. And so, I'm having lunch on Wednesday, I would write it down. One year, at the end of that semester, I look back and my Mondays were blank, completely blank. Now, I laugh because 100 years from now, somebody looking at it would think, oh, did she take Mondays off every week? But no, my Mondays were blank because on Mondays I could do nothing but teach.
Oh my God.
You see, so I went from class to class and I kind of run away and had my sandwich lunch hidden from everybody because I needed time to decompress.
Of course.
But I use that as a way of saying how it is our responsibility as scholars to look at the blank pages, if you like. Okay, because on the other days, I could write down, lunch with this board meeting, other things around my classes. But on Mondays, there was no time to do anything around those 3 classes. So what looked like nothing happening was actually the busiest and most pressurized day I had. And feminist historiography teaches us to ask what happened on those blank days, what's in those spaces. And we want to bring that questioning to how we construct the museum. And we have a woman as the chair of the academic council who has spent her life bringing that questioning to the story of the African diaspora. So,
Yeah, and even women are present in the whole history of Africa. We have stories of women, battling, struggling,
Yes.
and being a leader.
Bring leaders all the time.
Of course, the museum must include these stories, right?
Of course. So what I was trying to say is, of course, we are going to do that, but we are doing the other thing as well. That is, we also want to get beyond. We don't want to reproduce the situation where, for instance, in the United States, there's the struggle to teach African American history. So everybody knows the name of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and nothing else.
Who was,
and Barack Obama.
Yeah, and who was Martin Luther King? Coretta
Exactly.
King.
Yes, and
wife.
Missing. But even if Coretta King is there, who were the people that helped shape them into being? And that's the thing. We have to break the notion of history as the celebrated names. History is also made by the people who made us, our parents, our grandparents, who made it possible for us to occupy this seat. In his day, Martin Luther King's preacher father was as important to his community. He just created a son who circumstances made even bigger. Martin Luther King's mother was as important to shaping who he was. And there are generations behind. That's what I mean, that this is also trying to tell the story of the invisible generations, the invisible actors.
Let's talk about Ancestry, Ambassador. How Brazil and Ghana can join efforts to preserve the Black history, memories, and culture to present and future generations to come?
I have two answers to that question. I think the answer is relevant for all human beings and all humanity, and then I'll focus on women. The analogy I like to use is that when we meet a person with amnesia, we label it, we call it that, it concerns us. We know there is something wrong when an individual has lost their past, their individual past. And we try to therapize it and what have you. And when they're living with it, everybody knows there's been a mental break. We consider it extraordinary in the life of an individual. Why do we consider it normal in the lives of groups of people? Why do we consider it normal when people have been severed from their roots? We don't recognize it as collective trauma. It is, and people are beginning to realize that. So that's the answer, and that's true of everybody. I always tell my students, especially my African American students, if a Jewish person ever invites you to a Passover Seder, accept the invitation. It's a very important sacred ceremony. But that going to something familial that is based on this ritual of we were slaves once in Egypt, next year in Jerusalem, to help you remember who you are. What is our equivalent of that as displaced African people? What is our equivalent? Okay, ancestry matters not because you want to get stuck in the past, but because unless you know where you are rooted, you don't know how your branches are growing. We want to know our past so that we understand how we got here, to empower our youth to look to a future and to know that they have one, and to know that with this past you can have a future. And we recognize this, as I said, as human beings. We are taught to face our traumas even. We are taught to face even the bad things that have happened to us and learn from them and grow from them. So that matters as significantly for the collective as it is for the individual. But also with respect to the museum that you're talking about, I would say there is a kind of parallel dual focus. One, we are celebrating our own stories, but we also are working in a context where we recognize that that celebration of our stories is also in the context of a need for a corrective. You see, Euro-American students don't live with the idea that they have done nothing, contributed nothing, you know. Africans do, not only in the diaspora, but as a result of imperialism and colonialism, even on our home continents. We have been severed and dispossessed from our history. We live with the idea that, you know, history is what is written. Whereas I come from a country in which history is encoded in our culture, is encoded in our dance, is encoded in our song. Communication can be in dress. A lot of people who go to Ghana know, you know, it's a funeral, we're wearing black or we're wearing red. And there's a difference between when we're wearing black and when we're wearing red. Is the body buried or not buried? You know, you go to a spectacle like the Asante Hini's court. And if you're a stranger, it looks, wow, this is just wonderful. We're all wearing wonderful colored clothes. But if you are in the culture, you know there's a difference between how the people wear their cloth. Is it long or short? Where is this tied? What colors they're wearing? What are the symbols? We have a whole system of communication through proverbial symbols. That is our history, you know. So when we create a museum that includes in it the art and architecture of our past kingdoms, it's celebrating us. And it is also giving the lie to the idea that we had no history before the Europeans came.
True. That is the importance of stories, right?
As telling stories.
And then it led us to ask you, what is the importance of women's literature to preserve stories of Africa and culture and heritage?
Well, women have always told stories. We've always been storytellers. And there's a way in which a certain kind of dispossession of women, you know, has meant they have found avenues and outlets. You know, I spent 20 years working with a group of women. At one point, I think there were as many as 240 of us. There's a press in the United States, the Feminist Press, which supported a project called Women Writing Africa. We produced 4 volumes of women's cultural production, and it was just the tip of the iceberg. The 4 volumes were geographic: Southern Africa, West Africa and the Sahel, East Africa, North Africa. And what we were doing was looking at, I say women's cultural production because it wasn't just the usual poems, plays, published poems, plays, and fiction of the 20th century. We were looking at testimonial evidence, women's wills, early women's journalists, and we also included women's songs and sacred and profane songs, casual songs, you know. And in collecting those, you realize you had the history of their communities through what we were singing. Women work, and they work in the fields, and they sing in the fields. And the women's work songs tell you who they are and what they do. There was one, I remember us having this very interesting discussion. It was a lullaby. I believe it was Mali, it was either Mali or Burkina Faso. It was definitely one of the Sahelian countries. A woman was trying to comfort her weeping child. You could tell she was really getting tired, and basically telling this child, please don't make me trade. You're very valuable. I want to keep you. Don't make me have to trade you for salt. Okay? Now, who would say that? And it's clear in the context that salt is valuable. Now, in that one sentence, that one phrase in a lullaby, you have encoded the history of value of what was being traded across the Atlantic, across the Sahara. Okay, that's a reference not to the transatlantic trade, but to the trans-Saharan trade of gold and salt. Salt was the most precious of commodities. And that's the only context in which you would compare your child. You know, we're used to mother is gold, for example, the comparison with gold. Yes. Well, here you had a song that reminded you that at some point and in some cultures, salt was more valuable than gold. That's history. It's a fragment of a song, but that's history that contextualizes.
And of course, this in our daily life, it has an impact as well, right?
Yes, yes.
And even the act of the mother trading their child for salt.
Yes.
What would it mean?
Exactly. Who are we? What have we gone through? What kind of choices have we had to make? What kind of value have we had to think about on our place in the world?
Wow, food for thought. Ambassador, in your book, Testimonies of Exile.
You found my poetry book.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful one. I want to read the whole thing, okay? You use poetry to talk about migration, displacement, the cross-cultural struggles of exile, loss of identity, language, and other topics. Why is this subject so important to understand the place of women today?
Because it's our experience. That particular volume, especially the early ones, come out of my personal experience of growing up in exile and growing up, following my politician professor father from Ghana to Holland to Mexico to England. But I think those experiences made me realize that my particular experience was also a universal one. For instance, right, my father was leader of the opposition to our first president, Kwame Nkrumah, at the time of independence. That is why we were exiled when Ghana was becoming a one-party state and the opposition was either killed, imprisoned, or expelled, or had to advise themselves and leave. But because of my father's work, we first went to the Institute of Social Studies in Den Haag and in Holland. And then we went to Oxford University, and my father was a fellow at St. Anthony's. And so at the Institute of Social Studies, there were people from everywhere in the world. I mean, I remember making friends, but my best friends were these twins who were Filipino. There were Filipino people from India, people from everywhere. And then we arrived, yes, we lived in a little English country village where we were the only Africans for miles around. But at Oxford University, there were people from everywhere. So it wasn't until the coup d'etat that overthrew Nkrumah and we could go back home again that I registered that it wasn't the ordinary life of university professors.
Of course.
I thought, I skipped out Mexico. We went from Holland to Mexico to England. And father was a fellow in all of those places. But because this was how I lived my life, I thought all university professors start off one place, spend a few months or a few years here, and then go somewhere else and spend a few more years, because everybody I met was having that experience. And it wasn't until I was 13 and could go back home again, and I realized Father had been in exile, that I registered that because of his exile, he was mixing with people in similar situations to himself, and that all of these professors were doing what my father did and scrambling to look after their children by getting fellowships in places where they had international professors. So I had to correct my notion of what a university professor did. And I then had the privilege of getting employed at a wonderful university where I stayed for 40 years. I'm one of the few people I know that had only one job all my life, but it wasn't the experience of my father or his childhood. So that's one. But I think, therefore, particularly relating your question to women, it's what I've been saying all the time about the unusual, the unexpected. That is, well, it's two things, actually. It's the ordinary quotidian that therefore doesn't get recognized, which is the control of women, the food, the everyday life, as well. And it's those things that are the in the control. In almost all societies today, women control the daily and the everyday. And that is what forces you to look at movements that otherwise don't get articulated. And so, and as we know, displacement gives you another vision. In today's world, the refugees, the displaced people, the mothers who make choices because they are trying to look after their children. So on the one level, you have, the UN Security Council discussing what's going to happen about these wars and rumors of wars. But on the other level, it's the women who are in the refugee camps having to deal with how are these soldiers who are supposed to be liberating us actually helping us? What kind of pressure are they putting us on? If I'm a woman and I want to feed my children, what kind of choice do I have to make if the soldier who's supposed to be giving me the rice or the beans for my children is making it clear that he's only going to give me the rice and beans I need if I give him something he wants?
Which is?
We all know what that is, all right? So, if he just wanted his hair washed, it wouldn't be a problem. He's not asking me to wash his hair, which he shouldn't, but that's probably not a difficult decision to make. He's asking me to give him my body in exchange for the food for my children. What do you do as a woman? Say, my children are going to starve?
Yeah.
It's not a choice. But then your community makes you live with that lack of choice. And even if you negotiate the refugee camp, then you have to face what freedom means with that history that then nobody wants to talk about.
And it leads me to think about the importance of feminist literature. Feminist literature, not
Yes.
only a literature made by women, but with the focus of empowering women. Tell us about this. What is the importance of the feminist literature to empower women?
That's, first of all, it is written from the point of view of as women as subjects, not as women as objects.
That's true.
And that's the critical difference. And, again, we are used to people telling stories. For example, the whole movement to redress racial inequalities. Everybody understands that the history of writing stories, poems, plays that feature Black and Indigenous people is part of a movement to center the story of race in the community. For women, it's the same. And for Black women, it's even more critical. You know, there's a famous anthology of Black feminist writings called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but some of us are brave. And that's because traditionally, all right, I'll tell you an example told by a woman much in the news, I think quite surprised for controversial reasons, Kimberly Crenshaw, the African-American legal scholar who developed the theory of intersectionality as a mode of analysis. I was on leave at UCLA when she was working on those pieces. And she said something to me that stunned me and that really lived with me. And we were chatting, we were walking to a lecture or something, we bumped into each other. And she said to me, do you realize that Black women do not exist as a bibliographic category, categorically in the law? By which she meant, if you're like her and you are doing work on laws in which Black women are a subject, either as plaintiff or defendant, you cannot go to a law library or even to a law book and look up Black women at the time. So you had to look up race law and all the laws that had something to do with race and extract those that had women in them, or you had to look up women in the law or gender and look through all those laws and see if there were Black women involved in those cases. Classificatory, that's the word I was blanking on. We did not exist as a classificatory category in the law. And this was 1990. Okay, so that was a critical statement about how the structures work. And this is the point about intersectionality. It's talking not about individual identity, but institutional, structural identity. So that the law recognizes race law, and it has been pushed to recognize laws about women, but it refuses to recognize that there is a multiplicative factor if you are both Black and female in the law. You don't even exist. You don't even exist. Now, I'd like to give an example. My sister's an actor. And a few years ago, I guess it's about 7 years ago now, she was in a play that started at the Public Theatre and ended up on Broadway called Eclipsed. Okay. It is literally the only play ever on Broadway written by a Black woman, by African woman, Denega Ari, who's Zimbabwean, starring Black women. The entire cast was Black women. My sister, of course, was Ghanaian. There was a Ghanaian, a Sierra Leonean, a Haitian, a Liberian, and directed by a colored South African woman. And even one of the two producers was an African-American woman.
Super rare.
Okay, super. But what was Eclipsed? You see, Eclipsed was the story of the women of the Liberian Civil War. Who were the women who were in the camps of those warlords? And who were the women that eventually forced the peace? What were their lives like? Who were they looking for? That was the story that was not told.
how did you feel, culturally speaking, when working as ambassador in Brazil? Did you feel at ease, or did you feel it was a totally different culture while you were here serving as an ambassador?
Oh, that's an interesting and difficult question. I feel very at ease in Brazil. And if, even the geographic landscape, there are similarities. As we were saying earlier, things like the food, the music, you can feel the roots. And the food is so the same. You can cook all the Ghanaian dishes because you can get all the ingredients, So there's a real familiarity. If I'm honest, what was different was getting used to the difference in cultures of being an academic and being a diplomat. And that has nothing to do with Ghana, Brazil. That has to do with the academy and the diplomatic service. The kind of freedom and liberties you have, or at least used to have, in the academy to ask what you want, to explore. A question is a legitimate form of discourse, where at times in the diplomatic service, you need to learn you should not ask this question, at least not in this context or in this way. And I have to learn a different kind of restraint and whisper the question afterwards. So it's those kinds of engagements. And therefore also, it's a lot of work. Diplomacy is a lot of work. And so very often you don't have the time, the energy, the whatever, to break out of the diplomatic world. Especially I think people who are here with their families, I think, have a different engagement. If they're here with school children, they have to deal with children at school, which can be a relief. If you're here with children who don't need your everyday, when am I being picked up kind of thing, it can be easy just to want to go home and sit with your family. I'm here without my family. And so I feel that my engagement outside, beyond the strictly diplomatic circle, has been because I'm a poet and I love and collect art. So that has been my avenue. I haunt, galleries and museums and bump into people. And so therefore, and I've also met other academics. So I've met other academics, I've met playwrights, singers, gallery owners. And so that becomes the way in which I get introduced to a different world.
Speaking of art, let's wrap up our conversation with poetry. If you could choose a poem to describe all your experience in Brazil as a woman, which one would it be?
Well, that is an easy question for me because I had a wonderful Portuguese teacher who used to give me poetry and songs and so on. Mm-hmm. And one time he gave me a poem by Conceição Evaristo, who I just admire and adore. And I challenged myself to translate one of her poems. So I have a translation of her Voices of Women. So I would use that one because it's by her, because it refers to some of the things we've talked about. What is the role of women and how is our history encoded? And two, because I'm very proud that I managed to translate this poem into workable Portuguese. All right.
No, please, let's go for it in English.
All right.
Anyway, because I'm sure it's going to be beautiful, same way.
The voice of my great-grandmother carried the echoes of a child in the bowels of a ship, echoed the lamentation of a childhood lost. The voice of my grandmother carried the echoes of obedience to white folks who owned everything. The voice of my mother carried the echoes of soft revolt from the depth of other people's kitchens, from beneath the laundry bundles of the dirty clothes of white folks treading the dusty pathways that wind to the favela. And still, my own voice echoes perplexed verses like rhymes of blood and hunger. The voice of my daughter contains all these voices, collects into itself all these silent voices choked in our throats. The voice of my daughter collects into itself the speech and the act of yesterday, of today, and of now. And through my daughter's voice, we will come to hear the resonance, the echo of life made free.
Wow, stunning. A poem by Conceição Evaristo.
Yes.
Ambassador Abena Busia, thank you so much for your presence here. It was a big pleasure and honor having you here in our show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate and I'm honored by the invitation. Thank you.
You saw our program and our conversation with Ambassador Abena Busia. So I hope you had enjoyed it and see you soon.